This is the Art, Culture, and Politics, Marxist Approaches panel at the Platypus International Convention. Lucy Parker, thank you, and Walter Benjamin, Pat Proberg on Clement Greenberg, and Omar Hussein on Adorno. Brett, you will speak first.
Okay, so this talk is very simply titled Trotsky's Theory of Art. The title may sound banal or even boring, but is actually quite bizarre. Problematizing the unproblematized expanse of contemporary art production through Leon Trotsky's writings on art may initially appear counterintuitive. Well known as an integral figure of the October Revolution and ceaseless proponent of Marxism, it is not self-evident why Trotsky dedicated himself to writing a long study of Russian literature in the midst of revolution. An art critic Trotsky was not, so his 1924 book, Literature and Revolution, appears as an odd duck, or perhaps a platypus. Nevertheless, Literature and Revolution scintillates with original artistic revelations and even a new theory of art. And one gets the impression that such unprecedented clarity, and one might say an as yet unrivaled comprehensive portrait of the art of his moment, is the artifact of, and only of, the excitement of a new world in the making that now appears petrified. If, as theorist Greg Horowitz said in the recent Platypus panel on critical theory, that we are standing in the way of history, if we are blocking the passage of a new world, articulated long ago, then it might behoove us to investigate the stakes of this historical venture. These stakes included a new culture and a new art, and such a new culture was clearly an integral component to Trotsky. Literature and Revolution is a theory of history parallel to Trotsky's Results and Prospects. In the 1906 Results and Prospects, Trotsky assesses the bourgeois revolutions of the previous century and what unfulfilled latencies seemed to lead to their redemption by a socialist revolution. Trotsky's examination was not merely a cause and effect study, but a living theory of how the October Revolution also changed the meaning of history and in what ways. I won't get into Results and Prospects here, but Literature and Revolution is a similar exegesis of bourgeois art, what its implications were for the self-determining constitution of a new culture, and how the new demands of revolution changed the way traditional art forms are perceived. In this sense, Literature and Revolution is an artifact of a political becoming, the postulating of a new culture beyond class as a category, not a reality attained by the revolution. A decade earlier, Georg Lukács wrote a Hegelian study of the novel form, articulating the novel as distinct from pre-modern literature by way of its being a form in flux, a self-constituting form in the process of its own transformation. In other words, the novel is the paramount modern literary form specifically because it is a social problem, not a social solution, in a similar sense to how reification is a problem to be resolved and was something to be gained by resolving it. This also means understanding it as a problem, though. By the time Trotsky writes Literature and Revolution, the modern becoming, which Lukács articulated in the novel form, had become such an inescapable problem that new dynamic forms, unseen and unprecedented, were unanimously called for by the political revolution, which sought to problematize this autonomy of art to pursue new self-determining courses. Thus, Trotsky's statement, art, like science, not only does not seek orders, but by its very essence cannot tolerate them. Artistic creation has its laws, even when it consciously serves a social movement. Truly intellectual creation is incompatible with lies, hypocrisy, and the spirit of conformity. Art can become a strong ally of revolution only insofar as it remains faithful to itself. Trotsky echoes, or pre-echoes, Walter Benjamin's idea that art can only have the correct political tendency if it has the correct aesthetic tendency, an idea that would later influence Theodor Adorno's aesthetic theory in the sense that what Adorno later identified as the incomprehensibility of art is the precondition for greater reflection and a more sufficient social totality. I'll get into this a little bit later. Every moment of Trotsky's theory claims an autonomy of art, recently freed and not constricted by political reality. But what does this mean? First, this can be illustrated by the very attentive historical and formal criticism of pre-revolutionary bourgeois literature, a newly constructed tradition that can be constructively negated, and this foreshadows Greenberg's description of art as its further entrenchment in the area of its competence. This is where Trotsky contributes something new to the theory of art, and here does the previously unthinkable. He promotes, not condemns, the art of the peasantry. This is not to say that he promotes the politics of the peasantry, but makes a significant distinction between art and the political sentiments contained within it. In other words, he defends the art over the artist, or the politics of the artist. An idea emerges of the fellow traveler of the revolution, not synonymous with it, but parallel. Politics and art grasp each other indirectly for the first time, and the sheer inescapability of the revolution allows room for autonomous expressions of it that provide multiple, new, and dynamic perspectives that allow it to be seen in its totality, unobstructed by ideology. Regarding young peasant poets, Trotsky says, "It's as if they feel for the first time that art has its own rights. Why do we relegate them to being fellow travelers of ours? Because they are bound up with the revolution, because this tie is still very unformed, because they are still very young, and because nothing definite can be said about their tomorrow. As if an artist ever could be without a tendency, and he means without a political tendency or an overt political tendency, without a definite relation to social life, even though unformulated or unexpressed in political terms, end quote. Trotsky reconstructs Kliuev's, and I'm almost positive I'm butchering his name, literary peasant world in order to illuminate, from an alternative angle, the dynamism of the revolution. The way Trotsky speaks of Kliuev's world is as a tinsel fairyland, that a modern person cannot live in such environments. Kliuev's world is a mesmerizing individual dream world, a slowly rotating mobile of glistening objects. Kliuev's peasant world is womb-like, one might say, an archotic experience whose apparent individual piece is also a foreboding of social awakening. Through delimiting the autonomous formalism of art, Trotsky is also able to construct an adequate image of cultural and political prospects previously unseen. The exhaustive portrait of the individual peasant womb, this is my terminology here, throws into relief the radically different set of objects emerging in modern experience. For instance, the telephone, the train, the bustling development of metropolises, and so forth. So in order to understand the world in flux more consciously and more thoroughly. Similarly to the way Lukács thought that the short story would take grip of the transient world, or rather that he took very seriously the novel's half-art as a real expression of transforming social conditions, Trotsky perceived that social conditions exerted an influence on the form of Russian literature, demanding études, or sketches. It is easy to see how new cultural forms and mediums like radio, television, and so forth would soon come to pass, as continual transformations required to meet the needs of a modern person, or a new human, to quote Trotsky, that needs art less and less in accord with a society whose emancipated subjects are no longer bound to the continued suffering that gives reason for art's existence. What Trotsky sees in the fellow travelers' literary works is an openness of perspective that they participate in, but are not the wholly constituting expression of, because they're seemingly complete and subsistent worlds, what Adorno would later call their hermetically sealed quality, is open to a new form of criticism that sees them as dissonant with society but not outside of it. It is nowhere implied that the most reviling or even anti-Marxist principles should be foreclosed, but rather diagnosed to provide a portrait of social conditions at their most dynamic and heterogeneous. Art is not only not exempt from this, but is exemplary in this regard. Regarding another young writer, Trotsky says, one can take man, not only social, but even psychophysical man, and approach him from different angles, from above, from below, from the side, or walk all around him, end quote. The autonomy to perceive humans from different angles, artistically, which means a formalist problem, is a freedom opened up by political conditions and one that simply implies, without having to force the new humans Trotsky called for. And here's another quote from Trotsky. Our Marxist conception of the objective social dependence and social utility of art, when translated into the language of politics, does not at all mean a desire to dominate art by means of decrees and orders. It is not true that we regard only that art as new and revolutionary, which speaks of the worker, and it is nonsense to say that we demand that the poets should describe inevitably a factory chimney or the uprising against capital. Of course, the new art cannot but place the struggle of the proletariat in the center of its attention, but the plow of the new art is not limited to numbered strips. On the contrary, it must plow the entire field in all directions. Personal lyrics of the very smallest scope have an absolute right to exist within the new art. Moreover, the new man cannot be formed without a new lyric poetry. But to create it, the poet himself must feel the world in a new way. Feeling the world in a new way has resonance with us today as an idea specifically because it seems stifled. But the new feelings are, again, tied to the radically incomplete world in flux, to quote Trotsky again, about another Russian writer who's kind of disappeared from the historical situation today. Pilniak has no theme because of his fear of being episodic. Pilniak wants to show present-day life in its relations and in its movement, and he grasps at it this way and in that, making parallel and perpendicular crosscuts in different places, because it is nowhere the same as it was. The themes, more truly the possibilities, which cross his stories, are only samples of life taken at random, and life, let us note, is now much fuller of subject matter than ever before. Life in revolution is camp life. Personal life, institutions, methods, ideas, sentiments, everything is unusual, temporary, transitional, recognizing its temporariness and expressing this everywhere, even in names. Hence the difficulty of an artistic approach. The transitory and the episodic have in them an element of the accidental, and the accidental bears the stamp of insignificance. The revolution, taken episodically, appears quite insignificant. Where is the revolution, then? Here lies the difficulty. Only he will overcome it who fully understands and feels the inner meaning of this episodic character, and who will reveal the historic axis of crystallization that lies behind it. End quote. Art played a role in determining this totality by expressing the incompleteness of it. In the theory of the novel, Lukács describes art as always saying "and yet" to life. The creation of forms is the most profound confirmation of a dissonance, end quote. Such a framework, endemic to both Lukács' theory of the novel and Trotsky's theory of the fellow travelers, brings up a vast number of questions for the contemporary, and also forces some too easy associations. Contemporary artworks are often framed not as the problem, but the solution. Or at least there is not a clearly defined dissonance between an artwork and the society it expresses. This is enough to warrant the question of whether or not what passes itself as art today could even be called so, but I will leave that to the side for now. In contemporary artworks, we are faced with similar formal problems to those that Trotsky faced. For instance, if Trotsky was very critical of the nefarious endeavors to create a permanent proletarian culture, or the propensity for artists to enlist in the prolet cult, because the proletariat was a transitional phase to a much broader human freedom yet to be determined, and certainly beyond the class divisions of proletariat and bourgeois, what then can be said about the radical art activism of today that seeks the alliance of a vague working class with no long-term plan? Is this alliance then doomed to an eternal struggle? Moreover, Trotsky noticed that such meandering political commitments were not without their compromising effects on the aesthetic experience. For example, in order to be pals with the revolution, and these are Trotsky's words, Mayakovsky relied on antiquated cliché truisms that were backwards of modern life. Trotsky also saw this wanting to be pals with the people, or a mass base, without distinction as a return to the bourgeois intelligentsia in the 19th century, who, quote, deprived of a cultural environment, sought support in the lower strata of society and tried to prove to the people that it was thinking only of them, living only for them, and that it loved them terribly. And just as the populists who went to the people were ready to do without clean linen and without a comb and without a toothbrush, so the intelligentsia was ready to sacrifice the subtleties of form in its art in order to give the most direct and spontaneous expression to the sufferings and hopes of the oppressed, end quote. That is, such an appeal to the people disregards the splintering, or as Richard Westerman said last night, the pluralism that Trotsky saw as endemic to the most significant leftist successes over the course of its history. Okay, the knock of death. Another example, in much new experimental music, we hear the sounds of Kliuev's Tinsel Fairyland, the subtle droning of vintage synth gear, and nostalgia for a private world. The music is more like a narcotic, a therapeutic substance applied to the subject to cure what ails it, or what is taken away by capitalist modernity. Electronic music might have once been counted amongst those modern things, like the telephone, for example, an artifact of a dynamic mutability, but one that is still in a state of endless, almost unsustainable decay. One is reminded again of Trotsky's description of Kliuev when we look at much recent album artwork, for example. And here's another description from Trotsky. A wheat and honey paradise, a singing bird on the covered wing of the house, and a sun shining in jasper and diamonds. Not without hesitation does Kliuev admit into his peasant paradise the radio and magnetism and electricity. One could go on with new art forms harkening back to the past, redigesting those bourgeois bohemian tropes that fail to die, in the futurist aspects of new net art, for example, or the return to painting, and so on and so on. But what does this all amount to? Art wants to pass. It wants to finally die. It is not mere eccentricity that every great artist believed they were making the last artwork. If art finally died, this would signal that the untransfigured suffering of men over the ages, as Adorno said, would finally be transfigured into something else. The culture industry, with its ceaseless thrusting of art in our faces, is the penance for failing to achieve socialism. In this sense, art and culture is not the solution, but the problem. Maybe I'll forego my conclusion since we're short on time. But I'll end there.
I'm just going to put the recorder on here. Make sure we get everybody. Lucy Parker on Walter Benjamin.
Walter Benjamin would seem to be so prevalent in critical theory and literary studies, almost always misrepresented. What would it be to read him radically? More than anything else, it would be to understand what his own intentions were in his work, in his own moment. For our purposes, I'm going to focus on two of his most overquoted essays, The Author as Producer and The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. I shall also put the latter in What does it mean, we might ask, in The Author and Producer, addressed to the Society for the Study of Fascism in 1934, that Benjamin asserts, we can say, a work which exhibits the correct political tendency need demonstrate no further qualities. We can also decree, a work which exhibits the correct tendency must necessarily exhibit all other qualities. The second formulation, he states, is more correct. Let us explore this statement for a moment. It is not asserting that all works of great quality in the present moment will necessarily exhibit the correct political tendency. We may find it to be the case that there are many that do not, but of those that do, they must necessarily have every other quality. To turn this around would be to say that no work that exhibits regressive tendencies will possess every other quality. Moreover, it is to say that the form, the qualitative character of the work of art is essential to understanding its underlying political tendency, as much so as its purported content. The author as producer was addressed to an audience that would largely have seen themselves as socialist, as Marxist. Benjamin yet finds it necessary to address to them a re-evaluation of literary culture in their moment, if they are able to understand more fully the subjective characteristics of fascism. It is also necessary, given this, to address preconceived ideas of what progressive art works might be on the left. If one were to imagine that art had the capability of being emancipatory in and of itself, one would have the wrong idea. Conversely, if one were to think that art and culture were trivial or unnecessary to address in the bid for emancipation, this would also be a vulgar misconception. Benjamin, who was experiencing the 1930s in Europe, is attempting through his work to critique the regressive tendencies on both the right and left politics of his era, to see the threat of the rise of fascism to be expressive of the regressive tendencies of mass culture in the capitalist era. That to dissolve the possibility of fascism and to overcome capital are one and the same project. To achieve this, following Lukács, it would be to attempt to address the failures of the left up to this moment. As Chris pointed out in last night's opening plenary, in the work of thinkers like Benjamin and Adorno, fascism arises in the 1930s as an outcome of the failure of Marxism up to this point in time. Thus, to say a work which exhibits the correct political tendency must necessarily exhibit all other qualities. Benjamin is stating his project. He takes up the investigation and critique of bourgeois and mass culture of his time to address the contradictory character of the subject under modern capital and exposit its regressive and progressive tendencies. So when we turn to the text, Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, what does Benjamin go on to tell us about the task that is required for a ruthless critique of his own moment? Theses about the art of the proletariat, to quote, after its assumption of power, or about the art of a classless society, would have less bearing on these demands than theses about the developmental tendencies of art under the present conditions of production. Their dialectic is no less noticeable in the superstructure than in the economy. It would therefore be wrong to underestimate the value of such theses as a weapon. They brush aside a number of outmoded concepts, such as creativity and genius, eternal value and mystery, concepts whose uncontrolled and at present almost uncontrollable application would lead to a processing of data in the fascist sense. The concepts that are introduced into the theory of art in what follows differ from the more familiar terms in that they are completely useless for the purposes of fascism. They are, on the other hand, useful for the formation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art. It is less useful in overcoming the current situation under capital to prognosticate on what art might be under changed economic circumstances, but rather we have to utilise an understanding of what is and what has occurred in order for transformation of these circumstances to take place. It is also to say that Benjamin recognises that, as he makes reference to Marx, that a change in consciousness has taken place between Marx's moment and his, so that while for Marx it seemed self-evident that the exploitation of the proletariat under capital would create the conditions necessary for the proletariat to overcome itself, it becomes clear to Benjamin in his own moment that this has not occurred. Hence, Benjamin sets out his project as a politicization of the realm of aesthetics in modernity. As he states at the end of his essay, humanity's self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is the situation of politics which fascism is rendering aesthetic. The aestheticization of politics is what he sees as taking place all too readily by fascism. How did this kind of capacity for aesthetic experience occur? The core of the Work of Art essay undertakes this exploration with regard to the changes that can be seen at both a particular and general level within aesthetic experience of modern subjects, to reveal the kind of radical change that has taken place for the subject in this era of technological reproducibility. So for Benjamin, it becomes a task to understand the nature of this new kind of perceptive sensitivity, aesthetics itself being a term, while coined in the ancient Greek verb aesthesai, to perceive, first came into modern usage in the late 18th century, i.e. with thinkers such as Kant. Benjamin's essay attempts to reveal something about the changed sense perception in the modern era, following the industrialization of the 19th century. So this is how he sets about an attempt at a politicization of aesthetics, by looking in extreme detail at the art of his own time, by investigating the techniques and technology by which it is made, to see what it is that they reveal about his moment, in terms of how it reveals our changed sense perceptions. And just to refer back to the idea that Trotsky mentioned, that of feeling a world in a new way. By investigating the techniques, what works of art can tell us in their content and form about the kind of world we live in at the present, and how they relate to our own moment. For it is only in coming to a greater understanding of our own moment that we conceive of what it would take to change it. In principle, a work of art has always been reproducible, but, as Benjamin explains, the mechanical reproduction brings about a radical transformation in our experience of images and of the world. To quote, "Photography freed the hand of the most important artistic functions, which henceforth devolved only upon the eye looking into a lens. Since the eye perceives more swiftly than the hand can draw, the process of pictorial reproduction was accelerated so enormously that it could keep pace with speech. A film operator shooting a scene in the studio captures images at the speed of the actor's speech. Just as lithography virtually implied the illustrated newspaper, so did photography foreshadow the sound film." There are things we have to be careful to note here, even if these initial points seem straightforward. It is important to begin to notice the way that Benjamin attempts to address how new technologies arise at a given moment. It is not just the case that a prior technology progresses in a linear way to the next technological development. Rather, a technology such as lithography brings about a change in the way people look, interact, and receive information about the world, which in turn calls forth a demand which had not arisen before in the same way for illustrated news. Similarly, although sound recording had been invented in the 19th century, it was not until the technology for moving images had further developed that the desire to create sound film itself arose. We see this way of thinking again at play in relation to authenticity and the mechanical reproduction of art. To quote Benjamin, "The presence of the original is the prerequisite to the concept of authenticity." Here again, though, we see in the term prerequisite an important point that is similar in form to the last, that if we turn it around, we see that the absence of the original is the prerequisite for the loss of authenticity. How, though, can Benjamin go on to compare a handmade forgery with a technological reproduction and see how the forgery preserves the authority of the original, whereas the technical reproduction does not? Shouldn't both challenge the authority of the original, or neither? No. Benjamin's argument is that a fundamental change in our idea of authenticity occurs with the technical reproduction, in the way that our experience of the reproduction surpasses the original. Firstly, in that photography allows you to see things that you cannot see with the naked eye, and secondly, that the photograph can meet the beholder where they are in their own living room, for example. To continue with that idea that the reproduction surpasses the original, and the idea of space and time, Benjamin shows how we may see these ideas as changes in human sense perception. During long periods of history, the mode of human sense perception changes with humanity's entire mode of existence. To quote, "Every day, the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at very close range by way of its likeness, its reproduction." Here comes the identification of a tension at play between closeness and distance in the image in modernity, between uniqueness and permanence, the image of the world as seen by the eye, versus the transitoriness and reproducibility of the image in the world seen in reproduction, such as in the picture magazine. To pry an object from its shell is the mark of a unique perception, whose sense of whose sense of universal equality of things has increased to such a degree that it extracts even from a unique object by means of reproduction. Thus is manifested in the field of perception what in the theoretical sphere is noticeable in the increasing importance of statistics. The adjustment of reality to the masses and the masses to reality is a process of unlimited scope, as much for thinking as for perception. What ultimately is at stake in these changes in human sense perception? Nothing other than the recognition of the radical change to the core of human subjectivity which has occurred under the rise of capitalism and industrial revolution, as Lukács exposits in History and Class Consciousness. Only through a greater understanding of the changes that have taken place in subjective experience, which has subjected capital, can we begin to understand what it would take to change our current conditions, including the current way we experience artworks. Hence, with Benjamin, the commodity form of value can be expressed or can be revealed with critique in the form of the artwork, in terms of the internal dialectical relationship of categories that Benjamin highlights, in time between the permanent and transitory, in space, in terms of distance and closeness, in value as in terms of cult and exhibition, which I wish I could have more time to explain, but in terms of cult and exhibition value, and indeed in its usefulness versus its uselessness, in relation to the artwork's uniqueness versus its reproducibility, its particularity versus its generality, and its commensurability versus its incommensurability. A successful critique would be to pass out this dynamic in a given artwork with regard to its changes over time, and with acknowledgement of one's own existence within that changing history. One cannot examine these things as if external from history, and the dynamics of particular versus general, commensurable versus incommensurable, which we too are expressive of in our own moment under the conditions of capital in changing ways. In our own moment, we have to realise how we too experience a condition similar but changed to Benjamin's. The problem for us is to understand what Benjamin was saying is that we ourselves have come to a point when the very understanding of history, of the way things change and the way things continue, has become less self-evident. Even in trying to understand Benjamin's moment, we have to keep in mind the problematics of our own in relation to history. Why is it important to understand these things in relation to art? It might be that art no longer reveals symptoms about society to us in the way that it did to Benjamin. However, if we are to understand the character of the period that we are trying to work through within the reading group, an understanding of the characteristics of the artworks in these thinkers' own time is necessary. If nothing else, it is the case that the thinkers of the Frankfurt School, Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer, Krakow, Bloch, it's useful to thinking about these dynamics of continuity and change engaged with artworks. It is further to instrumentalize a critique of society by working through these ideas as they manifest in culture. Only by understanding their own moment in time might we approach ours with an understanding of the dynamic of continuity and change within as necessary for the possibility of imagining freedom.
Yes, please move forward. There's a little bit of space here in the front. Still a chair over here. Do not distract me, I'm already talking.
Give me a face for not making sense.
Give you the Okay, and now Pat.
Okay, so
Wait. And in the back, please. No, I just want full attention on top. Okay, now Pat Carberg on Clement Greenberg.
So the title of my talk is Clement Greenberg's Crisis. So I'll just begin. In 1924, shortly after Lenin succumbed to what was fundamentally a battle with exhaustion, Georg Lukács put the finishing touches on his short pamphlet concerning the now deceased Russian revolutionary. Lukács's book, entitled Lenin, A Study on the Unity of His Thought, intended to reveal how Lenin was, quote, the only theoretical equal to Marx. Instead, however, of chronologically laying out Lenin's theoretical development, Lukács attempted to make an overall point about what brought together Lenin's various concepts into a larger whole. As Lukács makes clear, quote, "For this reason, no attempt has been made to present the problems which occupied Lenin's life either in their entirety or in the exact order in which they occurred. Their selection, sequence, and development are dictated exclusively by the desire to make their interrelationship stand out as clearly as is conceivably possible. My aim here today is to do something similar, albeit in an even more schematic fashion, for Clement Greenberg. Much has already been written on his personal and theoretical development, and specifically on his early interest in, and later enunciation of, Marxist politics. And there can be no doubt of his outright disavowal of Marxism later in life. As he wrote in 1984, quote, "My political views have indeed changed enormously. I no longer believe in socialism, although I may still want it ideally. I've become something of a political agnostic, although it still goes against the grain to vote Republican. At the same time, I've turned more anti-Bolshevik than ever. I can't call Leninism communism. Communism, too, remains my ideal," end quote. A commitment to the ideal, yet a revulsion of the politics. This is a familiar picture. It is a part and parcel of the larger failures of Marxism in the 20th century. But at bottom, Greenberg may not have been able to develop in any other direction. Because he was born in 1909, Greenberg was a witness to all of the major failures of Marxist politics in the 20th century. In any case, the point is that there is no question as to there being a gradual yet steady change in the art critic's political inclinations. Yet in the same essay I quoted just a moment ago, the critic makes clear that another set of convictions has remained quite firm. Quote, "I wouldn't say that my literary or cultural views have changed all that much during the past 50 years. Maybe they've evolved or been revised. I hope so. I would also hope they've expanded. But changed? No." To understand Greenberg, I believe it is necessary to understand how he sees the upheavals of society functioning within the art object. In other words, it is of the utmost importance to understand how he viewed the very best of modern painting as simultaneously establishing and reflecting the very crisis of its being. Just as Lukács wrote for Lenin that the vanguard party is, quote, "both a product of and conscious contributor to historical development," so Greenberg views the highest achievements of painting in similar terms. Painting, at its best, is, to use a piece of jargon rarely employed by Greenberg, dialectical. What this really boils down to is that the art object is, in fact, the context in which it operates. That its very historical occurrence signals and embodies the very possibility of its being in a particular moment in history. This notion of the work of art hypostasizing, being the context for its possibility, is what I see as unifying Clement Greenberg's overall thinking. It is, I believe, what he really means when he says that his views on art have not changed. To begin more thoroughly, I'd like to take a look at the critic's 1948 essay, The Crisis of the Easel Picture. This pithy article, spanning a mere 4 pages in Greenberg's widely influential anthology of essays, Art and Culture, from 1961, provides a succinct snapshot of how Greenberg saw context in form. The premise of the article is familiar to perhaps even the most basic of art history students. The easel picture, that quote-unquote movable picture hanging on the wall, had traditionally aimed to act as a window out into the world. In Greenberg's words, it, quote, "cuts the illusion of a box-like cavity into the wall behind it, and within this, as a unity, it organizes three-dimensional semblances," end quote. In other words, the easel picture traditionally acts to give an impression that the images embedded in it are an extension of our very own space. The easel picture mimics reality. With the advent of modern painting in the mid-1800s, however, something radically new begins to happen. The Impressionists, urged on by Manet before them, unwittingly pushed painting into a strange new realm, the beginnings of a flattening abstraction. To quote Greenberg, "Monet, Pissarro, Sisley, the orthodox Impressionists, attacked the easel painting through the consistency with which they applied divided colors. The operation of these colors remained the same throughout the picture, every part of which was treated with the same kind of emphasis and touch. The result became an evenly and tightly textured rectangle of paint that threatened, but only threatened, to reduce the picture to a relatively undifferentiated surface." To recap, for Greenberg, the orthodox Impressionists, which is to say those painters who were radical despite themselves, who pushed painting towards abstraction while nevertheless attempting to render naturalistically with a new level of precision, inaugurated a set of operations in which contrasts were minimized, where a new type of all-over technique began to emerge, therefore minimizing difference and leveling out the picture plane as never before. The road, it is perhaps clear, leads directly to the cubist grid, that governing structure, which in certain paintings by Jackson Pollock, for example, levels out hierarchy in favor of a type of dynamic repetition. In Greenberg's words, this new type of work, quote, relies on a surface knit together of identical or closely similar elements which repeat themselves without marked variation. In other words, it is the, quote, kind of picture that dispenses, apparently, with beginning, middle, and end. This is precisely what Greenberg was referring to in a 1955 review of Jackson Pollock, where he wrote that recent works by the painter, such as Lavender Mist, which is at the National Gallery in Washington, had, quote, literally pulverized value contrasts into a vaporous dust of interfused lights and darks in which every suggestion of sculptural effect was obliterated. The crisis of the easel picture, then, that movable canvas, which traditionally looked out into the world, is a crisis in the history of Western visual representation, or Western visual art. It is a moment of uneven, and I'm again tempted to say dialectical, development. While on the one hand, modern painting retains the use of the movable picture, the canvas stretched over its support, it simultaneously acts to obliterate all that illusionistic space between the viewer and the objects projected before him. In a particularly handsome description from another essay, Greenberg writes that painting has, quote, rendered the modern painting has rendered the pictorial stage shallower and shallower until its backdrop has become the same as its curtain, which has now become all the painter has to work on. But there's more to this brief account of pictorial history than simply meets the eye. At the very end of his essay on the easel picture, Greenberg ties everything together with supreme eloquence. Quote, the dissolution of the pictorial into sheer texture, into apparently sheer sensation, into an accumulation of repetitions, seems to speak for and answer something profound in the contemporary sensibility. The all-over may answer the feeling that all hierarchical distinctions have been literally exhausted and invalidated, end quote. To make sense of this argument, it may be helpful to first turn to another of Greenberg's essays. In his widely influential article, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, Greenberg makes the argument that in order to grasp the historical possibility of the avant-garde, it is, quote, necessary to examine more closely and with more originality than hitherto the relationship between aesthetic experience as met by the specific and not generalized individual, and on the other hand, the social and historical context in which that experience takes place, end quote. In other words, as Greenberg makes clear throughout the essay, to understand an abstract painting is to understand its possibility in the historically specific epoch of capital. Moreover, for a viewer to have an even more true understanding of the avant-garde, they must properly perceive it as having, quote, a superior consciousness of history. In other words, to understand Picasso is to recognize that his work engages in what Clement Greenberg terms, quote, a new kind of criticism of society, a historical criticism, end quote. And historical criticism is indeed the sine qua non of the modernist impulse, be it in art or in politics. As Greenberg makes clear in the same essay, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, quote, it was no accident that the birth of the avant-garde coincided chronologically with the first development of scientific revolutionary thought in Europe, end quote. And what else could scientific revolutionary thought mean other than Marxism? The avant-garde and Marxism are therefore bedfellows. The point I really want to make is that the historical crisis of capital is what brings into being both Marxism and the avant-garde. But the permanent crisis of capital, like the crisis of the easel picture, is too uneven, is also complex, dialectical. This is precisely what Greenberg meant when he argued against T.S. Eliot, who T.S. Eliot had argued that culture was in a general decline, and Greenberg argued that even if Eliot were right, quote, the opposite of cultural decline, we would see the opposite of cultural decline in science and scholarship, healing and engineering over the past 50 years. In other words, if capital did put culture into decline, it was still able to provide us with a higher standard of living than had ever been imaginable in the history of man. With this notion of uneven development of capital in art, the final section of Greenberg's crisis of the easel picture comes more fully into view, and I'll read just one part of the quote again. Quote, the all-over may answer the feeling that all hierarchical distinctions have been literally exhausted and invalidated, end quote. We have to bear in mind that this essay was written in 1948, 8 years after the murder of Trotsky, with Stalinism firmly long having taken command of the Soviet Union, and with McCarthyism running rampant in the United States, it seemed that all hierarchical distinctions between capitalism and communism, for instance, had been exhausted and invalidated. Already existing communism, the Soviet Union, was therefore decidedly not progressive in relation to capital, as it was already existing as well. With the rise of right-wing ideologies, both east and west of the Atlantic Ocean, it became impossible to distinguish between progress and regress. What final scale of values could anyone look to for guidance? The crisis of the easel picture registers this ambivalent moment. In other words, it does not represent it. It is it. The crisis of the pictorial tradition in modernity is the crisis of capital in the same period. This, in turn, means something very important for the relations between art and politics in Greenberg's day. It means that the crisis of the easel picture, which, again, simultaneously reflects and generates a larger crisis within capital, is still able to produce something of quality. And this term, quality, is key for Greenberg. For him, to bestow this term on a particular work of art, and he always dealt with singular works, meant that its being, the work of art's being, lived up to the expectations and promises of the past. A quality abstract painting was one in which the history of modern Western art was embedded, but that also means the history of capital in that work. For a work of art to be strong, it had to have digested the history from which it emerged and to which it therefore responded. To put it another way, despite the failures of the left in the 20th century, which ultimately led Greenberg away from his Trotskyist pedigree and towards a profoundly liberal position late in life, something of quality, something which contained in it the complexities of history, the nuances of a dialectic, the hopes and failures of the project of modernity, could still be made. Because of the uneven development of capital in Greenberg's day and age, it was still possible to create and recognize quality painting which registered a crisis. Our age, it seems, is different. I do not doubt that it is still possible to make good painting, although I question it. But what I really question is the possibility for us to recognize good painting. Whereas in Greenberg's moment, political regression may not yet have completely caught up with and wholly absorbed art, today this is not so clear. The point, ultimately, is to recognize the divide between Greenberg's day and the moment, and our particular moment. If artwork of quality, artwork that was able to register a crisis, was still possible in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even 1960s, there's an open question as to whether or not this is possible today. If art and capital developed along an uneven path in an earlier part of the 20th century, it seems that political regression in our day has finally caught up with art. Where this leaves us is not for me here to decide. But what is clear is that the character of our political and artistic failures of the past 50 years is all the more shrouded in mystery. Whereas in Greenberg's day, a crisis was simultaneously a failure and a triumph, today the crisis may be that we can't recognize that we are in one.
Last but not least, Omer Hussein on Adorno.
I wanted to begin with a kind of preface or disclaimer, but I think it was actually addressed really well by all three panelists. I'm going to use the language of late capitalism or late modernity a lot, maybe just because I'm not that creative with my terms. But I think what's important is, for me, the question of understanding Adorno's approach to art in relationship to Marxism hinges on the question of how we understand Adorno's historical moment. So when I speak of late capitalism or late modernity as the moment Adorno is writing about, it's kind of the moment in the wake of the failures of the Second International, rise of Stalinism, rise of fascism, and something about late capitalist society for Adorno makes the question of freedom of Marxist revolution a more complicated one than it might have appeared in the past, and I kind of want to relate that to the question of Adorno's addressing art. And I'm also going to be showing some work throughout. I feel bad because I'm not going to be talking about them very concretely, and they're really going to be examples, but hopefully we can get more concrete.
No, I
it's
could
okay.
go it over here, but either way I'll be.
It is self-evident that nothing concerning art is self-evident anymore. Not its inner life, not its relation to the world, not even its right to exist. These are the first lines of Adorno's aesthetic theory. In this statement, Adorno articulates a central thesis that carries through all of aesthetic theory: the simultaneous impossibility and necessity of art in late capitalist society. Understanding this claim is essential to understanding Adorno's approach to art and its relationship to the task of Marxism. The question is then raised: what is it about late modernity that places art in the peculiar position of being both impossible and necessary? And I think, so I want to very briefly articulate a kind of historical shift that can be marked by late modernity. Historically, modern society was once a dynamic force of constant change. Early bourgeois thinkers understood that, though society may not yet be ideal, the realization of freedom was a historical possibility for the future. Marx himself naively suggested that socialism was inevitable on the grounds of capitalism and its dynamic character. But in the wake of the failures of Second International Marxism, late capitalism raised doubts not only about art, but about the entire history of modern society. Auschwitz indicted the history of humanity as potentially nothing more than the continual refinement of how humanity could best dominate itself, progress in how effectively humanity could destroy itself. For Adorno, art's uncertainty was bound up with a universal uncertainty. Nothing concerning modern society was self-evident anymore. Not the value of its life, not its relation to the past, not even its right to exist. In an exchange between Adorno and Horkheimer, recently published in the New Left Review, Adorno states, "The horror is that for the first time, we live in a world in which we can no longer imagine a better one." This statement touches on the character of historical regression marked by late capitalism. And basically what I mean there is, I think it was something Lucy pointed to very nicely, that the task of thinking of how to consciously transform society was complicated by the fact that society appeared non-transformable, that you couldn't imagine the better future that you were supposed to realize. Humanity had regressed in its ability to both recognize social possibilities and to practically achieve these possibilities. The umbilical cord between theory and practice had been broken. Society had never confronted humanity as so alien to its own desires and so unable to be transformed. For Adorno, the task demanded by late capitalism was to think through the possibility of transformation in a society that appeared to possess the inevitable force of nature. In a world in which one could no longer imagine a better future, the task demanded was one of recognizing the potentials for a future that couldn't be imagined. And I think that paradox is something that Adorno wants to address with art, how to realize or recognize potentials for something you can't imagine. Adorno recognized that though historical regression made art an impossible task, the same regression made art necessary. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno states that philosophy lives on because its moment of realization was missed. The continued existence of art and philosophy was itself an index of missed historical opportunity. The continued existence of art and philosophy expressed social needs that had not yet been met by society. Art and philosophy were necessary to the extent that they could provoke awareness of a historical possibility that had been missed. They could provoke recognition of historical potential that had yet to be realized. In this sense, Adorno's treatment of art hinges on understanding art as a social fact. Adorno understands artworks as expressions of society, as objectified truths about the society they are a part of. For Adorno, the critical potential of modern art was related to the complicated ways in which modern society appeared in the artwork, the way in which art related to its status as a social fact. And so Adorno, on one level, acknowledges that art is a social fact. It testifies to a truth about society. But what he finds worth pursuing for 200 pages is the the mediated character between art and society, so that the social fact that art it testifies to isn't always going to be obvious. The way art is social isn't always going to be made obvious. Adorno addresses the relationship between art and society through the category of artistic autonomy. The question Adorno poses is, what would it mean to understand art both as a social fact and as autonomous from society? Adorno addresses how this antinomy, the antinomy between art and society, was not always inherent to art, but rather was itself a product of historical transformation. Modern bourgeois society marked a transformation in the relationship between art and society. As Adorno states, prior to the emancipation of the subject, art was undoubtedly more immediately social than it was afterward. Its autonomy, its growing independence from society, was a function of the bourgeois consciousness of freedom. And yet, as Adorno states, on the other hand, the bourgeoisie socially integrated art much more completely than any previous society had. The ever-present yet latent social character was made increasingly manifest. And so this is a kind of Adorno addressing a peculiar relationship between art and society that happened in modern society. That art became both more autonomous, it had the freedom to be other than society, to explore its potentials in an isolated realm, and yet at the same time it became more social in a particular way. And so for Adorno, he wants to think through the way in which this relationship between art and society plays out throughout the history of modern society. Here, Adorno discusses the peculiar transformation of art in modern bourgeois society. Autonomous art was a product of the bourgeois division of labor. The possibility for art to be autonomous from society was a freedom granted to art by modern society. But at the same time, modern society valued art in a way traditional society never had. Art came to be significant as a way of making sense of the experience of living in modern society. Art was both granted the freedom to be autonomous from society and was simultaneously tasked with giving society meaningful expression. Bourgeois society raised the question of the relationship between art as social fact and art as autonomous. I want to pause here 1 second, because I think one real task in addressing Adorno's treatment of autonomy is to not naturalize a specific relationship between art and autonomy. In the post-World War I world, we kind of have a specific idea of autonomous art versus social art, abstraction as autonomous, formalism as autonomous, realism as somehow social. A significant point that Adorno is addressing is that these antinomies didn't appear in the same way in early modern art. That, for example, in this Manet still life, it was both understood as an autonomous work of art, that this wasn't life, this was a painting that you looked at as separate from society, that it was interested in specifically artistic concerns, perspective, pictorial organization, but at the same time, through those means, it was still an expression of society. Society could see itself refracted in the artwork. The artwork communicated something about society to modern society. I'm going to read and I'll come back to this point. It's important to note that these two characteristics, autonomy and social fact, didn't always present themselves as autonomous, as antinomies. Adorno understood that the radical transformations in art that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century were a product of art's status as autonomous. In its autonomy, art was given the ability to continually transform itself. But this revolutionary transformation in the arts, enabled by art's autonomy, was also understood to be the social expression of a revolutionary and transformative historical moment. Art was transforming itself according to its own laws, and yet this autonomous self-transformation was understood as the expression of social transformation and change. So the point being is that we kind of associate that like the problem of autonomy hinges on art. Like if art chooses to be abstract, then it's autonomous. If art chooses to be realistic, then it's social. The point that Adorno found in early bourgeois modern art was that the question of art's autonomy wasn't dependent only on art, but in fact on society. That society actually incited formal revolutions in Monet and Courbet, that society demanded to be experienced in a particular way that forced artists to think about the formal questions of how they were experiencing life. Impressionism was both an artistic, autonomous development, but also a social development. The world wanted to be seen in a particular way, and Impressionism tried to grasp that aesthetically. And so what I'm saying, it's no coincidence that the epitomatic example for this relationship is the Russian avant-garde. Or if you could, the work of Tatlin, Rodchenko, and Milievich were understood as radical, both artistically and politically. And so this is the kind of epitome of the point I'm trying to make, is that on one level, in a kind of isolated analysis, you could say this is autonomous art because it's abstract, and all these Russian constructivists were making abstract art. But the point that's registered is that it's actually less about whether the art's abstract or not, and how that art relates to the society it was made in. That something about Russian society, i.e. socialist revolution, made it that what seemed like radically abstract art didn't appear as autonomous from society, but it was actually an expression of a society that was changing. Art was allowed to change in a particular way because society itself was positing change. And this relationship between society and art is what I want to say becomes problematic in late modernity. In late modernity, the relationship between art and society begins to appear as increasingly antagonistic. Art, in its increasingly desperate attempts to remain autonomous from the barbarity of social life, now seemed to register an opposition or negative stance towards society. Thus, the task of articulating the relationship between art and society became a more difficult one. You could have the same abstract picture, but to attempt to understand how that abstract picture was social, became a much more difficult problem after the Russian Revolution and after the failure of the revolution. Abstraction in this sense had a certain social truth, whereas in post-World War II, the point would be that it was more of a task and a complicated task to draw out how art was social. As Adorno states, and I'm going to read along Adorno quote and then try and flesh it out. As Adorno states, art, however, is social not only because of its mode of production, in which the dialectic of the forces and relations of production is concentrated, nor simply because of the social derivation of its thematic material. Much more importantly, art becomes social by its opposition to society, and it occupies this position only as autonomous art. By crystallizing in itself as something unique to itself, rather than complying with existing social norms and qualifying as socially useful, it criticizes society by merely existing, for which Puritans of all stripes condemn it. There is nothing pure, nothing structured strictly according to its own immanent law, that does not implicitly criticize the debasement of a situation evolving in the direction of a total exchange society in which everything is heteronomously defined. Here, Adorno registers the critical stakes he recognized in the autonomy of art. I think this is it also gives us insight into how Adorno thought about autonomy. That late capitalism confronted society as totally alien to it and as totally dominating all aspects of society. So the artwork, even by existing, by saying that I'm something that's not society, that I'm art, that I have my own internal laws of coherence, implicitly for Adorno criticized a situation in which all of social life seemed to be dominated by an alienated law, capitalism. Whether this was actually possible, whether art could achieve this autonomy was less the point, but the point was, what did it mean that art was attempting to achieve this autonomy? Artistic autonomy was not reducible to a specific style or specific type of artwork. Rather, all art, by attempting to be art, by attempting to be a self-enclosed, self-sufficient experience, by attempting to create a meaningful experience on its own terms, already registered an opposition to society. In an alienated society in which all aspects of social life were dominated by the logic of capital, art set itself the impossible yet necessary task of attempting to be other than society, of attempting to secure a space outside the bounds of capitalist society. In this way, Adorno recognized the utopic moment that existed within the concept of art itself. Art attempted to be what capitalist society denied to humanity, an autonomous and self-sufficient subject, free from the domination of society. Adorno recognized this utopic moment in all artwork, both high art and popular culture. And I think this is an interesting point, that it wasn't simply about like purity or aesthetic purity or kind of geometric abstraction. That say even in Disney films and Mickey Mouse, the fact that the film is constructed on its own, seemingly own immanent laws, that Mickey Mouse, the way Mickey Mouse is portrayed isn't immediately reducible to a social need, but is rather simply about the story of Mickey Mouse, right? We confront movies as stories in themselves, as these little worlds in themselves. So even in the kitschiest movie, this question of autonomy is posed by the way in which the movie Mickey Mouse attempts to be its own secluded world apart from capitalist society.
Homer, it's been 15.
Okay, almost done. For Adorno, the truth of art as a social fact was expressed most accurately by the way in which art attempted to be other than society, rather than in the ways art attempted to be most apparently social, i.e. in its themes and its contents. I want to take a minute here and try and flesh out the stakes of this complicated claim, that why is it that art is most social when you can't tell that it's social, that kind of paradox. This claim is closely related to Adorno's claim that late capitalist society was false. In this claim, Adorno, like Marx, is attempting to articulate a relationship to early bourgeois critical philosophy. For Kant and Hegel, the truth of modern society, the essence of its character, was not in what modern society was, but what it could become. The essence of modern society was in its ability to transform, to change. Humanity was defined not by what it was, but the possibilities of what it could become. Thus, for Adorno, late capitalism was false to the extent that it appeared unable to be transformed, to the extent that it appeared as the inevitable condition of humanity. Marxism historically had understood itself as the project of transforming bourgeois society, and in this sense, of practically realizing the truth about modern society, its ability to self-transform. In late capitalism, when the possibility for transformation appeared dismal, when society confronted humanity as alienated and unchangeable, the task for Adorno was to attempt to register the essential truth of the moment, that despite what the facts seemed to say, society's true potential lied in an unrealized future. To the extent that the present testified to being unchangeable, society was false. Thus, for Adorno, late modernity demanded an approach of negativity. If society seemed static and unchangeable, the possibilities for transformation had to be articulated negatively. Society had to confront the difficult question of what it was not, but what it might work to become. Society as it existed had to recognize the potentials of a future that seemed impossible to imagine. For Adorno,
Let's leave it there. Okay.
that's good.
Okay.
Obviously, we've only reached a very deep set of problems, and we have very little time to discuss. I did want to give, this is very important for us, I do want first to give 2 minutes to each panelist to respond to each other on the question. On the question of what is the contributing and where is the disparity, perhaps, or the change between the presentations that you have given. Brett?
Okay. I guess, to start with Omer's presentation, this idea of art as a social fact, I think that this is what is kind of missing today, for example. I'm curious why this sounds so odd in some ways, because it's not really taken for granted anymore in ways that it once was. And the idea that art can exist outside of society successfully is not something that's really intrinsic to art. It's part of a broader mentality that things can exist in a state of disintegration, which I think Adorno's point was that that's also a response to the mass integration of the world as well. But something, I guess, to move on to Lucy's talk. I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about with that was that this Benjamin quote of that we view our own alienation as an aesthetic order of the first, right? The quote was something like that, and the different directions that that's taken. And I think there's a direction that's taken that Habermas critiques in the Modernity an Incomplete Project essay. And he critiques there's a way in which this can be construed as like aesthetics contribute to the regression of the world in some ways. Not that had anything to do with what Benjamin was saying at all, but there's a way in which there's a viewpoint, it's a neoconservative viewpoint, that aesthetics or art contributes to the barbarity of the world in some way. And Habermas's point was that this is not the purpose at all. This has nothing to do with art. This has to do with the regression of society, which does not belong to art, but is actually exposed by art. And the other direction that was one with that was Adorno's philosophy of art, and I think the connection between what I was talking about earlier with the novel form as a form of dissonance from society. There's obviously connections between Adorno's theory of music and dissonance to be made with Lukács, but also that that artworks have a sort of, I guess it brings up the issue of alienation, right? That this alienation is not necessarily a problem of regression. It's also, at the same time, it's an issue of moving away from the lived world, or moving away from the world which is kind of obstructed by its instrumental use. And this is, for example, this is a point that Robert Pippin made in his examination of Hegel, that landscape portrait is more real than the landscape itself. And that begs the issue, then, Adorno kind of took this and ran with it and said, well, if that's the case, if distance is the issue, if we can only see through kind of alienating ourselves from things, then how far can we take this? So it's easy to see why the culture industry would come to replace art in a way, or that art, the pursuit of art takes art away from itself. And that's kind of a tricky sort of thing. And on the last note of Omer's talk, sorry. On the last note of Omer's talk, the confusion of avant-garde art forms for the possibility that they were actually trying to get at as a serious, as an issue, and to rip off of something I said earlier, if capitalism would stop robbing us of our experience, we would stop reaching for it in more desperate ways. And that includes the way that we think that avant-garde art forms a geometric abstraction, like as if it's like some form of magic. If we can if we could embody like this like geometric form, we're like automatically free in some way. But that's a problem, not the solution. Then I guess I'll end there with that.
Lucy, respond.
Well, I was particularly taken by the quote that Rhett mentioned from Trotsky about, I think the point was that that art can lead you to feel the world in a new way, and I think that really resonates with something that Benjamin is trying to address in his work of art essay, in terms of subjective experience. What else do I want to say?
Maybe you don't feel like...
Yeah, no, the subjective quality in Pax, it seems like the question for Greenberg to deal in what it would be the quality, that if quality art is possible, it seems to call into question like what that quality would be, and so to kind of to go back to Benjamin, to address the kind of the qualitative change that's taken place in our experience with artworks, which I think you've laid out in a really interesting way in relation to the crisis of the canvas. And in terms of Omer, I think and Adorno, the question of autonomy really actually problematizes Benjamin's essay in a really interesting way, because there's a sense in which the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction essay there's a sense in which Adorno brings up in his correspondence with Benjamin, that to some extent Benjamin pushes, throws autonomy under the bus in a bid to, out of a kind of the fear that it could be taken up in the current moment to a kind of fascist tendency, but that actually the question of the avant-garde has to be given as much weight as mass culture to be studied as something that has, which I think Pat brought up actually, was something avant-garde art having a more acute sense of his historical position in modernity. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I think that really what all the talks highlight is that it was possible in a certain moment in history for there to be a recognition of what art was doing or trying to do that now seems almost impossible. It's just the case that you guys look like art students. I mean, if you go into if you go into a contemporary art gallery and you feel confused, then it's not that you're stupid. I mean, nobody knows what's going on right now. But it's that there was a certain moment in history in which it was possible to conceive of an understanding of art and its relation to society that just seems almost impossible right now. That's what I think is registered by the distance between each of the four people that we discussed and us right now.
The issue of alienation and autonomy came up, so I want to talk about that, which incidentally is some of the stuff that I need to finish. But I think it's important. It's important in the sense that for Adorno and Benjamin, art in late modernity poses the question of how we relate to capital in late modernity. That art's autonomy is its expression as a social fact, because society itself appears alienated and autonomous from us. That we confront the art object as indifferent to our own needs, as something separate from us, as increasingly more and more inhuman, in the same way that society confronts us as increasingly alienated from us, as autonomous from us, as inhuman. And for Adorno, that's ambivalent, the kind of potentials of that there is a utopic potential in both art and capital, that it posits these possibilities that it can't really fulfill. But the dystopic element is that what it potentially posits is that the real possibilities in capitalism are actually being inhibited by humanity. That the problem becomes not one of adapting capital to humanity's needs, but that the potentials of capitalism themselves that appear to us as inhuman, and they task us with transforming ourselves to match their potentials. It's a complicated argument, but there's a way in which the late 20th century made apparent that humans didn't change the world, that capital did, that society that seemed alienated to us was the moving force. And for Adorno, this is both an expression of regression, but holds potential. And I think really quickly, a good concrete way we relate to this is with technology. That we both recognize the kind of unlimited potentials of technological production, and yet we confront technology as dominating and alienating to real human kind of interactions and production. And so there, that, I think, same kind of potential for transformation in human alienation.
Okay. Because of the lack of time, I'm going to have 3 questions to be asked first, and then give the panelists. If possible, please try to direct the question to an individual, if possible. Blue shirt, gray sweatshirt.
To ask a really vulgar and direct question, we're gathered here to think about the reconstitution of the left through its self-critique. Why should we care about culture and art? Why is this relevant? And anyone can answer it. Sorry, because it is a question for all of them. Okay, Brett, you can answer this.
No,
wait.
She meant 3 at a time.
Okay, this is for Omar. Adorno talks about how in, I believe it's in Enlightenment as Mass Deception, how sort of like at the time we had become a culture where we just kind of like listen to the news like the radio, and because the radio in its relationship with us, we're just listening, so I guess we've kind of become dominated in that fashion. But now, of course, we have the internet, we have blogs. So have we actually emancipated ourselves from that relation, or since many people just get their news blogs get their news from news sources, have we just like dominated ourselves again and just made an even bigger structure? And then,
But it's 3 questions.
yeah, we'll listen to all of them.
It's predominantly for Omer, but it could also hark back to Brett's presentation. And it's mainly a question of clarification and then lead into a question of contemporary art. But you talked about how with Impressionism and constructivist art, there was the kind of social change that took place, and then art somehow became the expression of it. And to me, it almost could have sounded like a cause and effect issue. There was a cause of change, and then artists rendered the effect. So I'm wondering if it's that simple mechanistic way that art responds to social development. And then also, my second question is, can the vice versa be true? Can art actually spark social change? A lot of it, since things can't seem changeable anymore, the basic crutch of your argument, a lot of social practice or relational aesthetics artists pose themselves as actually initiating alternatives that could produce changes in social production and relationships, which would then actually lead society to change. So in your understanding of art, or mediated by Adorno, do you think that art could do the opposite of the way you posed it? Can art make social change and reflect change of the society?
Thank you. Brett?
Okay. Well, I mean, really simply, I guess it's because, the reason we should care about culture is because culture cares about us so much. Because it's been thrust in our face so much that it's unavoidable. It's almost like a pathology in some ways that's come to replace politics. So, that's a very simple answer to that, I guess.
Can I say one thing really quickly? Just real quickly. Brett gave a teach-in last week, and one of the key points that he made was that modern painting, abstract painting, understands us better than we understand it in a certain way. So, it's relevant for us to understand art, because if painting is able to, is trying to convey something to us, we should try to be able to understand what that is, especially if it has a particular relation to the history of capital.
Okay. Mayor and Lucy, maybe that second question you might have an answer to also?
Yes, I also have something to say about this question.
Go ahead.
Mayor.
You, Lucy.
Oh, me first? Okay. Just on the subject of blogs and the radio. So something that Benjamin brings up in the work of art essay is the way in which under mechanical reproduction, the audience experience is transformed, and so yes, there is the sense in which, and he brings up again in The Author as Producer, that say the introduction of the letters to the editor page in a newspaper, in a sense, creates a forum in which, at any point, a reader could become a writer and respond as a critic. So I suppose, like in this contemporary moment, that the experience of writing on a blog, that it's both kind of has its potentials, but also it still has to be seen as operating within and under capitalism. So while there are potentials there, which Benjamin was pointing to in his own time with different art forms, they in and of themselves, they would not be able to generate the kind of transformation, social transformation that we would hope for. It would only be through understanding, through critique, through dialectical critique, these kinds of new forms, how we can better understand our own moment in society, that we would be able to conceive of change. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question relates to the point I was trying to make about the ambivalence of the fact that capitalism dominates us. That on one level, domination, as expressed by a variety of different cultural symptoms, it's obviously bad if we are the objects of domination, that if it's a society that's dominating us. Yet the social force and the social power expressed in the fact that society can exert such a domination poses actually potentially progressive potentials of society. The question would be attempting to grasp both the regressive, the dominating character of the way we relate to society, to the news, but also the potential that's embedded in the ways in which we are dominated by society and the news. That's an expression of societal and social power. The question, as I think Adorno puts it, is like, to what end? That art poses the question of expressing this power purely aesthetically. And so it poses the question of what would it mean if the power of society was more rationally utilized, rather than to dominate ourselves. We thought of a variety of things we want to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I have anything to say about Facebook or Twitter.
Yeah, I was trying to rush my question.
Sure. Well, the thing I think is interesting with blogs, maybe the only thing in relation to this, is that it's both like a real potential in technology, but it's staged in such a way as like an opening up of democracy and of community and kind of primitivistic like DIY. And so I think one thing that kind of conception has to work out is that those two things are pretty antagonistic to each other in some way. I really don't have much to say. I think another symptom of historical regression is that we look for changes that seem kind of significant, like the internet boom, in the absence of more total social transformations.
Okay. Unfortunately.
Should I answer Chris's question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just real quickly, I mean, I guess the idea that art should spark social change is already a sort of symptom of helplessness, or that it kind of exudes the idea that we've just like congealed into a state, into like a static object, or like even the term spark implies that like the fire has gone out in a way that it was once like burning really strong in a way. That sounds really cheesy. But I mean, but to extend the metaphor of like Trotsky's plowing in all directions, like this implies that art doesn't plow in any directions at all. That art just like kind of lazily just like plows like within arm's length or something. And it begs the question like what is the wind in the sails of the plower? I guess is the issue. To use like another like cheesy metaphor. Like what? I mean, can like the art plower just like start moving himself of his own accord? Right?
Okay. Thank you.